we were talking about the Sphinx, and I'd like to go back to the Sphinx
sure.
because you're talking about the rain water, and I'm wondering, in your opinion, why was it built, and was it built before they got wiped out? 'Cause I can't imagine, like, let's put ourselves back 12,000 years ago, and if we're experiencing something like that, I guess we're not in a position to go and build a Sphinx. Like, you have to be
The evidence suggests the Sphinx was already there 12,800 years ago. It was a monument that existed before the Younger Dryas, and that in the case of the Sahara Desert, and the place where the Sphinx sits is part of the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
In the case of the Sahara Desert, what happened 12,800 years ago, just as other parts of the world went into a deep freeze, further south there was heavy rain. There were thousand years, actually, more than 1,000 years of extremely heavy rain on the Sahara Desert during the Younger Dryas.
And we know that for a fact?
Yes, we know that for a fact.
Okay.
There's no doubt about it.
Nobody questions that.
Nobody questions that.
Okay.
But what they do question is what's called the precipitation-induced weathering on the Sphinx. And I want to pay tribute here to the work of Professor of Geology Robert Schoch, Professor of Geology at Boston University, who was introduced to the Sphinx by the late, great John Anthony West, who was a dear friend of mine. John had always felt that the Sphinx was much older than mainstream archaeology accepts.
What's the official date for the
Officially,
Sphinx?
the Sphinx is
4,000?
supposed to be about 2,500 BC, in other words, 4,500 years ago.
Yeah.
But the evidence of that it was exposed to about 1,000 years of heavy rainfall means that it must be much older than that, because there was no such rainfall in Egypt 4,500 years ago, and you have to go back to the Younger Dryas to find that humid, wet period.
So that would mean that there were humans living, like the civilization was still there during this rain.
Yeah, it would mean that it was there before the rain, before the Younger Dryas. The Sphinx already stood there. Now, when archaeologists criticize the notion that the Sphinx is older, this used to be the standard response. When I and my colleagues argued that the Sphinx is much older than 4,500 years old, they would say, no, that's impossible. The Sphinx is the work of an advanced civilization. There could be, we would find hundreds of monuments like that all around the world if a civilization of that sort existed. So obviously the Sphinx just dates to 4,500 years ago. And there was a famous quotation from the American archaeologist Mark Lehner, who said, just show me a single potsherd from that period. Well, the thing is that they've not revised that position since the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is a gigantic megalithic site. It's highly sophisticated. If you can create Göbekli Tepe, you can create the Sphinx. And Göbekli Tepe dates to 11,600 years ago, the end of the Younger Dryas.
How do we know that for sure?
We know that for sure from carbon dating. Carbon dating is often a very suspect dating method. Why? Because you can't date stone.
Yeah.
There is no technique to date stone, particularly if that stone has been exposed to the atmosphere for a very long time. What carbon dating does is it dates organic material that is associated with the stone. Now, the problem with that is that in many archaeological sites, the great temples of Malta are an example. Carbon dating is not reliable because those structures have been open to the world for a very long time. Many different cultures have been there, have been through them, and have left their mark upon them. And it's very difficult to say where this piece of organic material, when that piece of organic material was deposited, may not be the time that the monuments were created. It may be quite a different time.
Right.
You know, what you really want, and as far as I'm aware, this has not been found anywhere on, for example, Malta. What you want is a piece of organic material that you can carbon date, which is trapped underneath a giant megalith. And then you can begin to make the assumption that the megalith was put there according to the date of that organic material. But this is impossible in the case of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is carved out of solid rock. And it cannot be carbon dated. And no Egyptologist will claim that they've carbon dated the Sphinx.
Yeah.
They attribute the date to the Sphinx based entirely on context. And that context is suspect. They say that the pyramids date to about 4,500 years ago. The Sphinx is part of the pyramid complex, therefore everything is 4,500 years old. Well, that's all supposition. It's not fact.
And it's the official story, and it's set in stone.
It's set in stone.
No one questions that.
Nobody's supposed to question.
We're not
supposed. It's kind of heresy. This is where archaeology functions, and a lot of science today functions this way, like a religion. That everybody's just supposed to accept what scientists say.
I can't accept this official narrative because to me it's very obvious that it's flawed. It doesn't make sense to me, and I think I'm just applying critical thinking here. It's very obvious to me that no one could build this pyramid. I think it's 100 years that the official.
The Great Pyramid of Giza is supposed to be built in 23 years.
They don't even build like a triplex in Montreal in 20 years, so I can't see how.
It's a fair point, and the Great Pyramid is one of the most gigantic and complex monuments that exists anywhere in the world. My wife Santha and I have climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times.
Why?
Why?
Why did you want to climb the pyramid?
What a joy. Weren't you afraid to trip or just like kill yourself? Or somebody's killed every year falling off the Great Pyramid. It
could have been you, Graham.
Could have been.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why the Egyptian government has now made it a criminal offense to climb.
They banned you. Did you? Are you banned in Egypt?
I am presently banned in Egypt.
Is that because of your climbing?
No, it's because my point of view disagrees with the point of view of Egypt.
This bothers them more than the fact that you climbed the pyramid.
Yeah. The basic issue is Atlantis. Egyptologists hate the idea of Atlantis.
You don't really talk much about Atlantis, do you? I don't feel like you talk that much about it.
I don't talk about it more than I talk about any other flood myth from all around the world.
But this one it's a crime.
It's against you? It raises particular hostility amongst archaeologists. And they say, so you're suggesting ancient Egyptian civilization didn't have its own unique origin. They actually were influenced by somebody outside. So it excites sort of nationalistic feelings as well. But I don't know any single human culture that hasn't been influenced by other cultures. That's part of being human.
Yeah, exactly.
We learn stuff from other people. We share. We pass on our knowledge. We receive their knowledge. That's how things work. Why should Egypt be any different? Why should any culture in the ancient world?
So you were going to say you climbed the pyramid 5 times?
Yes, and on one of those climbs, and it was particularly noticeable. It was on what is called the Eid, the holiday that immediately follows the end of Ramadan, where people have been fasting for a month. And tens of thousands of Cairenes were out on the Giza Plateau having picnics. And some of them, hundreds of them, decided, we're going to climb the pyramid. And Santha and I joined them.
You did?
We climbed the pyramid with them.
And
that's our previous climbs and subsequent climbs had been on our own. Yeah. But that climb, we were accompanied by hundreds and hundreds of people from Cairo.
Didn't feel like you were like transgressing some sacred monument or some sort?
I don't regard it that way.
No?
I think the Great Pyramid invites us to transgress it. It's there posing a huge question. It's saying, figure me out.
Yeah, that's really
figure me
saying.
out. I am standing here. I am almost perfectly oriented to true north. My scale and dimensions coincide, provide a code for the scale and dimensions of the Earth, and that scale is of 1 to 43,200, which is not a
very important number.
It's a very important number. It's not a random number at all. Height of the Great Pyramid, the real height, 481 feet. I can't immediately translate that into meters. The Great Pyramid is a bit shorter now because it doesn't have its capstone.
Yeah, but they're almost the same size.
But if you measure the Great Pyramid today, there's a flat platform on top of it, and that's about 450 feet above ground level. But it was originally 481 feet tall, and you can tell that just by continuing the angle of the pyramid up to the top. That figure multiplied by 43,200 gives you the polar radius of the Earth. And the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid multiplied by the same number gives you the equatorial circumference of the Earth. And I don't think that's random. I think that's genuine. And I think it is there to pose a huge question about our past. I think the pyramid was designed to make people think. And it was created by people who thought very carefully. And they weren't just making a tomb for a pharaoh. They were doing something much more important than that. They were creating a permanent message.
But I'm still scratching my head. Why did they make it so complicated? so we don't even get it. Like it's
Well, we can begin to get it if we open our eyes and if we listen to what the pyramid has to say. If we listen to what it has to say, that almost perfect alignment to true north, and I say 3/60th of a single degree off true north, because a degree in astronomy is divided into 60 minutes. 3/60th of a single degree off true north is a tiny error.
Yeah.
It's an error, but it's a very tiny error.
Can you give us like an example of what does it represent? Like,
Well,
in our with our technology today, would we be able to be more precise than that?
Could we do that? Yes. Would we do that? No. What's the point? What's the point of going? You're already creating a monument that's almost impossible to build, which consists of 6 million tons of stone, which has a footprint of more than 13 acres, which is 481 feet high. You're creating this. You're creating something that's difficult anyway. It's not easy to build a pyramid. A lot of archaeologists suggest it's easy. It's not. You make a mistake at ground level, and by the time you get to the summit, you've got a corkscrew, not a pyramid. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
So great attention was paid to the creation of this structure.
And the relation with the sky as well. With the
If you listen to the pyramid, first of all, that tiny error, that tiny human error, tells us that this was a culture that paid attention to astronomy. You can't get that level of accuracy without using astronomy. You can't just figure out what true north, and forget about compasses.
Yeah.
Compasses do not give us true north or south or east or west. They give us magnetic north, which can be as much as 11 degrees off true north.
Yeah.
They're a rough guide to where north is, but they're not an accurate. If you want accuracy, you've got to use the stars.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, the Great Pyramid is saying to us, we use the stars. It says it to us in a number of ways. There are 4 narrow shafts that are cut through the body of the Great Pyramid. 2 of them emanate from the so-called King's Chamber, which is the highest of the 3 great chambers in the Great Pyramid, and they do exit on the outside of the body of the pyramid.
And we don't know what they're for.
Well, I think we do know what they're for. Again, if you listen to the pyramid.
They're pointing at
specific stars. And this is one of the enigmas of the Great Pyramid. Let me be clear. 2 shafts running from the King's Chamber right to the outside of the Great Pyramid. We know that they run all the way through the pyramid because in Victorian times, people would roll cannonballs down them, and those cannonballs would end up in the King's Chamber. They would climb up the outside, roll a metal cannonball down them, and lo and behold, they turned up in the King's Chamber. So they definitely are from the King's Chamber, and they exit on the outside. The ones in the Queen's Chamber do not exit on the outside of the Great Pyramid, and until 1872, they weren't apparent on the inside of the Queen's Chamber either. It took a curious person to
the one who used dynamite in the
that's Howard Weiss.
Yeah.
He was another one. This one was actually a British Freemason who was interested in the fact that there were shafts in the King's Chamber, and he went around knocking on the walls of the Queen's Chamber, and he found 2 hollow points, and he cut those out because you could do that in the 1870s. He cut those out, and lo and behold, they open into shafts. And those shafts are about this high and this wide. And they go horizontal for some distance, and then they rise up at an angle. And that angle, the angle of all 4 shafts, points at key stars. And this is where it becomes puzzling, because those key stars are in the position that they were in 2500
exactly.
BC.
That's why I was puzzled with your book.
They're in the position that they were in 2500 BC. And this is why I would never divorce the ancient Egyptians from the completion of the pyramid project, because the other aspect of it is the pattern of the 3 pyramids on the ground. And once you accept, as I do, the notion that the 3 great pyramids replicate the pattern of the 3 stars of the belt of the constellation of Orion, and take into account the phenomenon known as precession, which is a wobble on the axis of the Earth that changes, from our viewpoint, the positions of the stars as they appear in the sky. Once you take that into account, you're looking at the shape of Orion's belt on the ground as it was 12,500 years ago. So weirdly, we have a ground layout which speaks to 12,500 years ago, very close to 12,800 years ago. And then we're looking at shafts which point to 2500 BC, 4500 years ago.
So the shafts could have been added later on?
I think so. I think we have to take the ancient Egyptians seriously. They say that their knowledge was a legacy from what they call the first time, from Zep Tepi. And I would not say that the ancient Egyptians did not build the pyramids. I think they were closely involved in the construction of the pyramids, and I think they used preserved knowledge that had been passed down from thousands of years before. They were completing a project that had been begun thousands of years earlier. So if I envisage the Giza Plateau 12,500 years ago, what I see there are three relatively low megalithic platforms laid out in exactly the pattern, because the pyramids were then built on top of them. The Great Pyramid itself is built...
That's where I guess I'm skeptical, because I guess in my perception of today, I can't imagine starting a project thinking, oh, they're going to finish it in 8,000 years. Like it seems impossible to me. And it's such a major project that I would feel that when you start doing this project, you start in the idea that you're going to finish it. So when I was reading your book, I was trying to keep an open mind, but it seemed to me that that's where I feel like I can't really wrap my mind around it. It seems that this project is so huge, so wide, that it had to be made in an idea. And how can they be sure that thousands of years later, we would, like the Egyptians would take their legacy and finish what they had started, if they were trying to give us a message or something?
It's a fair point. But to me, the answer to that is simple. We have such things as secret societies. We have such things as the transmission of knowledge over thousands and thousands of years. I mean, nobody would dispute that the origins of the Old Testament in the Bible go back 4,000 years, and there's a continuity from then right through until today. Ideas are passed down, they're transmitted. I'm only suggesting that it was the same in ancient
You think
Egypt.
it was, so that would be sort of the same story with Plato, saying that he received this story from a 600 years ancestor that lived 600 years before him.
Yeah, who was being told a story that was even older.
Never. And that's why I need to put myself in this mindset that they probably respected the past way more than we do now.
Look,
And
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and tell you what I think happened. I think there was a lost civilization of the Ice Age. I think there were survivors. I think they did attempt to reinitiate civilization, but they weren't quite able to do so. They created, if you like, secret societies all around the world, which persisted for thousands of years, initiates to whom knowledge was passed down, waiting for the right moment to switch civilization back on again. If your project is to reinitiate civilization, and you discover that you can't do it at a particular time. The world during the Younger Dryas was a very complicated.
So you assume that people lived during that period of time?
Oh yes, people definitely lived, and we know they did.
Survived.
There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, all around the world.
But what I'm suggesting is that the project was put on hold for thousands of years, and it's very odd how all around the world, roughly 5,000 to 4,500 years ago, civilizations pop up everywhere.
Yeah.
Consider the pyramids of Caral in Peru, about 5,000 years old. Consider the Giza project and the whole beginning of the first dynasty in Egypt. About 5,000 years ago, the first dynasty begins. Consider Mesopotamia, roughly 5,000 years ago, all at once,
which
all
is
over
a
the
mystery
world.
as well.
It's a mystery in itself.
How can you start there being already so knowledgeable that you're able to build the Great Pyramid? It's like, oh, the first thing I build and it's perfect.
Yeah, it's a very odd thing, and I'm suggesting that there was a body of preserved knowledge, and the notion of a hall of records of Atlantis under the Great Sphinx might be a part of that. That knowledge was deliberately preserved, and that if you like, secret society, that group of initiates who passed the knowledge down from generation to generation, they would select the brightest and the best.
The priests in Egypt
They would select the brightest and the best from the local population,
right,
and they would initiate them into their system of knowledge.
That makes sense.
And gradually, a time would come where it made sense to switch civilization on again, and I think that's what happened in ancient
Was there,
Egypt.
you think, a shift in energy, or do you think there was like some kind of a paradigm shift where they felt like, how do you explain that suddenly they built the pyramids, or they built very huge monuments?
I don't see how the Great Pyramid could have been built without an inheritance of knowledge.
Yeah.
As you say, you would expect the first thing that's built to be relatively primitive.
Yeah.
You would expect to see signs of evolution. ahead of the Great
Like
Pyramid.
my baby's drawing, and her drawings are not very good, but she's improving, as she draws, and it seems to be how we work.
That's what we normally expect, but that's not what we see in Egypt.
No.
We see the best being the oldest, and we see then a decline. The pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties are very poor by comparison with the pyramids that are attributed to the
when you go,
4th
they
dynasty.
just look like
crumbling hills,
exactly,
little crumbling hills.
Yeah.
Pyramid of Unas, for example, which has fantastic texts written inside it.
But it's falling apart.
It's falling apart. It's a very poor work of construction by comparison. And yet the Great Pyramid and its two companions are perfect.
They are
almost perfect. And I would say that we are looking at the application of a much more ancient system of knowledge there. That's the best way I can explain the enigma to myself. The enigma of star alignments that speak to two epochs, that speak to 4,500 years before our time, and that speaks to 12,500 years before our time.
So what about the Sphinx and the archive room underneath its spot? So his name is Schoch, the geologist
Schoch,
that worked on it. He's the one who discovered it. Am I correct?
No. I think we have to give that credit to John Anthony West, and even before him to a scholar called Schwaller de Lubix.
So they use like a technology, like radar, sonar technology?
No, initially it was just a perception. Schwaller de Lubix looked at the Sphinx back in the 1920s, 1930s, and he just made a passing remark that it looks like this Sphinx has been subject to some kind of water erosion. And then John Anthony West, who was a dear friend of ours, who passed away in 2018, John Anthony West took that further, and he began to examine the Sphinx closely and looking at the erosion patterns on it and trying to explain them to himself. And then he got in touch with Robert Schoch at Boston University, who is an accredited geologist, and he asked him to come to Egypt, and Schoch then made a close study of the Great Sphinx, which involved much more than just looking at it. It involved seismic work as well, which identified a chamber under the left forepaw of the Sphinx.
That's what happened.
And he came to the conclusion that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx were caused by exposure to more than 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And then we have to invoke the science of paleoclimatology. When was there last a period of heavy rainfall in that part of the Sahara Desert? Answer, the Younger Dryas, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. So from his point of view, the Sphinx was weathered by heavy rains during that period, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. Doesn't mean that that's when the Sphinx was built.
No. There was some
the word
erosion
built is
in that
wrong.
period.
The Sphinx was carved out of solid bedrock.
Yeah.
It wasn't built at all.
But they added some rocks and
those are all let me be clear. I'm going to speak of myself and my colleagues here. Professor Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, very important Robert Boval, who's done the most important and significant work on the astronomy of ancient Egypt. Well,
you co-wrote a book.
Robert and I wrote a book together. Robert is actually Belgian, but he was born in Egypt.
I thought his accent was Belgian. I was trying to figure out what was his accent.
His soul is Egyptian, for sure. That's his true culture, and he is a brilliant archaeoastronomer. He's done a great deal of astronomy work. There's nobody who matches him in this field. We're all of the view that the Great Sphinx, and I'd like to mention another more recent researcher, Manu Seifzadeh, who has done a great deal. He is fluent in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Wow.
He's also fluent in the German language. This is important because the Edfu building texts that I mentioned earlier were partially translated when I first worked on them, but they've now been completely translated into German. And that complete translation absolutely vindicates the notion that the Edfu building texts are telling the same story as the story of Atlantis. And it's only gradually filtering out into the outside world because it's in German and needs to be translated into more widely spoken languages in order to get there. All of us are of the view that the Great Sphinx was originally not only a lion-bodied monument, but also a lion-headed monument. It was a lion. It was a huge lion. The Great Sphinx is oriented perfectly due east, and therefore it looks at the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the equinox, on the spring equinox, 21st of March, and on the autumn equinox, 21st of September. Now we get into complicated areas here, but the if you go to astrology, which again archaeologists will dismiss as complete nonsense, if you go to astrology, we live presently in the age of Pisces. Why? Because the constellation that rises behind the sun on the spring equinox is the constellation of Pisces in our age. But the old song has it right. We live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And within about 100 or 150 years, this precessional wobble of the Earth is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars. If it's wobbling on its axis, it's going to change the positions of the stars as we perceive them in the sky. And most importantly, it's going to change the pole star. Presently, our pole star is Polaris. But as that axis does this over a cycle of 26,000 years, other stars have been the pole star, and other stars will be the pole star in the future. And sometimes no star will occupy the area of space to which the pole of the Earth points. It will also affect the constellations of the zodiac that rise behind the sun at key moments of the year, the spring equinox, the autumn equinox, and the two solstices. And we live in the age of Pisces because it's the constellation of Pisces that presently houses the sun in our age. Before us, it was the constellation of Aries. It's not an accident that during the age of Aries, the ancient Egyptians' symbology was all about rams.
Yeah, they're
Before that, it was the age of Taurus. Taurus housed the sun on the spring equinox.
Again, is it in Karnak that you get all the...
Well, you have the ram-headed sphinxes in Karnak, which are built during the age of Aries. It's not an accident that the early Christians used the fish as their symbol because they were in the time of the age of Pisces. And the bottom line to all of this is that in that epoch of 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, that cataclysmic epoch that we now call the Younger Dryas, the constellation that housed the sun on the spring equinox was the constellation of Leo. So
that would be enough to convince anyone.
It doesn't convince archaeologists, but when you combine the two sciences, when you combine astronomy and realize that 12,500, 12,800 years ago, the Sphinx was gazing directly at its own celestial counterpart at dawn on the spring equinox. When you combine that with the geology that says that in exactly that period there was enormous rainfall that caused the erosion on the body of the Sphinx, then we have a much more effective method of dating the Sphinx than any kind of carbon dating, which we can't do on the body of the Great Sphinx. We have geology and we have astronomy, and both sciences coincide on dating the Sphinx to more than 12,000 years ago. And it may well be much more than 12,000 years ago. It could go back to the previous...
Which would be 36,000
years. Which would be 36,000 years ago.
That's way too far for a lot of people, I think, here.
And even for me. I think that the Sphinx is best tied to the epoch of about 12,500 years ago. And it was a lion-bodied monument. Then came this heavy rainfall. It destroyed that leonine head. It became heavily eroded and damaged. And in the time of the ancient Egyptians, who saw themselves as the successor of an earlier culture, who were completely open and honest about that, who said they received all their knowledge from the gods. Who saw themselves as the heirs, as the recipients of a legacy from that time, they saw the very damaged head of the leonine head of the Sphinx, and they recarved it into a human head, wearing the classic Nemes headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. Egyptologists say that proves the Sphinx was built by the ancient Egyptians. No, I don't think so.
The head is smaller than the rest of the body.
The head is much smaller than the rest of the body. It's completely out of proportion. It's a restoration project on a very damaged, very ancient sculpture. A sculpture on an enormous scale that we now know as the Great Sphinx.
To look at it, and it's obvious that the head was carved and afterwards because it's much smaller.
And the ancient Egyptians were masters of proportion. If they'd had a choice, they would not have done that. But they didn't have a choice. They had this very damaged head.
And they did something, whatever they could to...
But what they couldn't do is change the orientation of the Sphinx. And it will always gaze at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. My wife and I have been there many times at dawn on the spring equinox. And you can see that the Great Sphinx looks directly at the rising sun at that day. You go there on the summer solstice, it's many degrees to the north of east. You go there on the winter solstice, it's many degrees to the south of east. We've been there at every occasion, but at the equinox, perfectly looks at the rising sun and therefore looks at the constellation that houses the sun. And that speaks to the age of Leo. That speaks to 12,000 plus years ago.
Right. And now I want to get to this under his paw. Like there's this cavity, and the government never authorized any research for that. I'm aware.
Yeah, I kind of avoid conspiracy theories.
I know you do.
But
listen, there are conspiracies in the world.
Yeah, there are conspiracies.
Yeah.
Robert Schoch and his team did seismic work, quite simple seismic work, where you use a hammer and bash it on the ground and see how the sound waves reflect under the surface of the bedrock.
Yep.
And what those sound waves showed was a large, regular-shaped chamber, about 20 or 30 feet under the left forepaw of the Great Sphinx.
And that was like 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Oh, that was 1992.
So the technology we have nowadays would be much
we could do much more,
but we don't.
Well, oddly enough, the two leading Egyptologists, the leading Egyptian Egyptologist, Dr. Zahi Hawass, and the leading American Egyptologist, Dr. Mark Lehner, have been involved in drilling around the Sphinx, and they claim that drilling has been entirely to clear groundwater from beneath the Sphinx. But it's very odd that their drills went in very, very close to the place where that chamber is.
That drives me insane. Like I get really, really mad.
Me too, because this is a matter that could be put to rest relatively easily. If there were openness, if there were transparency, if there were no secrets, it would be possible to do ground penetrating radar. It would be possible to do seismic tomography with the latest equipment and to absolutely settle it, whether there's a large chamber under the Sphinx or not. Instead, Egyptology has chosen simply not to talk about this.
Not to talk about it, but I'm pretty sure they did do something about it. But they keep...
I can't help having that feeling.
Well, of course, that's how the world is. You were talking about secret societies, and the knowledge has been passed to a very tiny elite throughout the years. And I understand that some...
And there's another odd thing, which I've mentioned before, and I'll mention it again, is that both Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass received their college education courtesy of the Edgar Cayce Foundation.
What?
Robert and I documented it at length in our book, Keeper of Genesis, which is called The Message of the Sphinx in America. Well, it is possible because the Edgar Cayce Foundation, because of Edgar Cayce's statements, was very interested in the Sphinx.
Yeah, very much.
And what they did was they found two young men who were working around the Sphinx. Zahi Hawass, then not Dr. Zahi Hawass, was a simple inspector on the Giza Plateau. And they found the funding to send him through university.
What does that mean?
I'm not sure what it means. I'm just stating a fact.
Let's speculate.
And the same goes with Mark Lehner, who was also sent through university by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. And since then, both of them have completely distanced themselves from the Edgar Cayce Foundation.
Okay.
Now you have to wonder how sincere that distancing is. Zahi Hawass, until very recently, was still giving lectures to the Edgar Cayce Foundation, even though he claims to detest the whole notion of Atlantis. Just have to wonder. I can't help wondering.
I'm confused here. Very confused.
I'm confused too.
I don't understand, because I feel like Edgar Cayce is the one that brought this myth to life in the last century.
Yeah.
I read a lot of his books. Well, not his personal books, but a lot of his readings, and he kept saying that we would discover this chamber, and I feel like betrayed or very disappointed that it's not coming. And if we did discover it, I feel even more frustrated that we don't share this knowledge with the whole humanity. I feel like this belongs to me and you and everyone, and if it changes...
This whole mess needs to be unraveled. And it is a mess at the moment. There are so many conflicting interests involved in it. There's the interests of mainstream archaeology, which both Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner claim to represent and do represent. They are fully accredited Egyptologists now.
But they work for the government, do they?
Well, no. Mark Lehner works for the University of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And Zahi Hawass was the chief inspector of antiquities on the Giza Plateau. He became a minister of culture briefly.
Yeah, okay, he's the one I thought. Yeah.
He's
very high place in the government.
Very highly placed. Very close to... There were some scandals surrounding his name, and he faced a criminal charge, which was then dropped.
Okay.
And he no longer has a high government position.
Okay.
But he's still the Egyptologist to whom the government refers.
to be in charge of the biggest discovery of the last century.
Nor do I.
I don't feel okay with that. And why then is it unraveling this way? And, you know, I heard you say in an interview, you felt like that there was sort of a shift, like we need to know, and there is something at work in the world that makes us, I listen, you said it way better than I do, and I feel the opposite. Like I feel throughout our history, the known history of humanity, we forget, like when you say in your book, the conquistadors, when they got in Americas, they destroyed everything, and the Alexandria library, and you know, it's happened so often in our past that we destroyed our knowledge,
we destroy our own past. All the time. I feel the destruction of the Mayan codices in Central America.
It's like in our DNA.
You know, we deliberately destroy our own memory.
Everything.
It's a very peculiar
phenomenon. There's like a handful left of everything that was there, and it would have changed everything.
But the plain fact of the matter is that the Sphinx issue could be relatively easily solved with modern technology.
So why don't we do it?
Is there not a chamber beneath the Great Sphinx? Robert Schoch's seismic work back in 1992 says yes, there is a chamber underneath the Great Sphinx. Now
31 years later.
We've got much better technology today, and it could be relatively easily solved, but nobody is solving it. And I wonder why. And then I look at the connection, very definite connection between Zahi Hawass and the Edgar Cayce organization, between Mark Lehner and the Edgar Cayce organization. These are the two most powerful archaeologists working around the Great Sphinx. And I can't help wondering whether there's something going on that we're not being told about.
Well,
I don't claim that's a fact. I'm just puzzled.
Of course, we're wondering because I would think that Edgar Cayce would have, the foundation would have funded anything that would have proven.
I suspect that they did to some extent. But then we have to ask ourselves, when do they want this information to be released? Is there a particular moment?
I guess it's just very inconvenient for them because
Cayce made some statements about, and I don't remember the exact details about when this information would return to the world. And maybe there's an agenda at work here. Maybe in 5 or 10 or 15 years, the truth will out.
I never thought at this age I am right now that we wouldn't know. Like I feel like I expected that to happen before, so I'm disappointed.
I expect it to happen as well.
There's so much secrecy in our world.
If you're drilling around the Great Sphinx, identifying groundwater and drawing up groundwater from under the Sphinx, you're already there. You have everything you need to put this matter to rest and either say, yeah, definitely there's no chamber, or yes, definitely there is a chamber.
I think we're past this question. It's like, what's in there?
That's the next.
That's the big question.
Or indeed, if there is anything in there, has it been already removed? You know?
And that's where I get anxious. I don't even want to think about it.
There's too much secrecy,
everything.
and it's unnecessary. This is a global human heritage. Yes, it's in ancient Egypt. Yes, it belongs first and foremost to the Egyptian people, but
it
is a global legacy. It belongs to everybody in the world. We all have the same need to know the truth about our past. And the Great Sphinx is a very important structure in connection with that.
Yeah.
And resolving this issue would be relatively straightforward, and it's a puzzle to me. And as I say, I don't like conspiracy theories, but I have to feel there's some kind of conspiracy going on.
We know when we're being lied to.
Either a conspiracy of ignorance,
Yeah.
We're just so locked in a particular framework that we don't want to know,
Yeah.
or some sort of deliberate project.